David, how did you first get involved in witchcraft?
I was influenced by my mother. She wasn't a witch, but she was heavily involved in spiritualism. I think she used to attend a meeting in a church in Kentish Town, and also one up in Finchley at that time. I'm going back to the late mid-50s, the late 50s, and I do remember that her involvement used to cause a lot of conflict between her and my father. They were always arguing about it, mainly because she'd go out and she'd come back very late at night. He was a very down-to-earth, materialistic man. He was a company director. She was the complete opposite, and she was often trying to guide me in those very early days about things more ethereal. We used to have discussions about God, nature, that sort of thing. She always used to tell me about healing. I remember once in those days, for example, if you happened to burn yourself, one of the common beliefs at that time was you used to have to put butter on it, and I did that once at school. I burnt my hand, and they made me soak it in butter, and it increased the pain of the burn. And when my mother saw it in the evening, she went mad. She washed it all off and soaked a bandage in cold water, and she said, "Keep that on it." And nowadays, all these years later, they've suddenly realised that the proper way to treat people with heavy burns is to submerge them in baths of cold water, because it speeds up the healing. Only a little thing, but I mean, she understood things like that, and she was trying to explain to me that there were powers in nature. Unfortunately, my mother died in 1959, and her death had a profound effect upon me. I was in my early teens. Her death had a profound effect upon me. And eventually, I sought out, when I was a bit older, after I'd left school, I spent some time on the continent, just travelling around and working, doing odd things, picking grapes, picking pears, moving deck chairs on the beaches, that sort of thing. But when I came back to England, much to the disapproval of my father, I might hasten to add, I never needed money in those days, so that wasn't a problem. When I came back to England, I was 16, 17, I sought out friends of my mother's. One was a lady who actually, she is initiated, and she's quite well known in Ireland at this moment, and she's a white witch, and she actually writes books on witchcraft. I spent a lot of time studying under her and another lady, her name was Helen, and she was quite an elderly lady, and she taught me about a lot of things in white magic. I was actually initiated into it in 1964. I was initiated initially, well, you always are, you become what's called a first grade neophyte, which means you're accepted, you just take certain oaths, and basically those oaths are, I mean, they're nothing over sensational, but the reason they're kept secret, because they involve the use of certain words which are associated with certain deities, and if they got into the wrong hands, they could be they could be dangerous. That's the only reason you have to take oaths, and you just make promises not to name other people. I do appreciate it. It sounds like something out of Aleister Crowley, but you've got to remember that witchcraft, Wicca, is often borrows from white magic. I hasten to add, that's nothing to do with black magic or Satanism, but a lot of people, because they don't understand it, they automatically confuse it with Satanism. And basically, white witchcraft, in its proper sense, as it's supposed to be understood, as it's practiced, is just really understanding the powers in nature, understanding powers within yourself, and even then, with that understanding, learning how to utilise those powers, but you never use it to harm people. You can use it to heal, to benefit, or to influence. If that power is directed at people to harm them, then you can safely call it black magic. And that's where the confusion comes in, because magic itself is neither white nor black. It is neutral. It's a neutral force in the universe. I went through 5 initiations in the end. It took about 4 years. You take the secondary degree, and then you take the 3rd degree, and when you undergo the 3rd degree initiation, you automatically become a high priest, or in the case of a woman, high priestess. There were two more initiations after that, which I can't really discuss. And if you understood what they were, you'd realise why I can't discuss them, because you literally go beyond. It's learning. It's what's. All I'll say is it's going beyond the mental realm. And as most people operate on the mental realm, it's very difficult to sort of explain something that's beyond it. You come to accept or learn about certain powers in the human psyche itself. I mean, certain manuscripts you have to read and certain incantations you have to learn.
So were these documents taken from ceremonial magic?
Most of the ones I saw, in fact, was given in the end, were actually handwritten. And they've been passed down for centuries, or decades at least. How many times they've actually been rewritten down through the centuries, I don't know, but they're very, very old.
And what kind of things did they teach you?
The secrets of astral projection, the secrets of the ethereal body, what happens to you when you're asleep. I mean, what really happens to you, where you actually go when you're asleep, which is something not many people think about.
Can you tell us where that is?
Well, it's highly sort of secret, Mark. Again, it's not meant to sound arrogant. But you know, another thing that you're taught about is you learn about that question on everybody's lips is what happens after death. But you're taught to more or less reverse that and say, no, wait a minute, where do you go after death? I've never asked where you were before you were born. Because you must have been somewhere, because something that doesn't exist cannot come into existence. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to get too complicated, but I'm just trying to give you a skimping idea of what is actually involved in Wicca. And of course, there's also involved in it is understanding, as I said, the human psyche, understanding different levels of consciousness.
And how do you feel once you have this new understanding?
It gives you an inner strength. But add to that, I mean, it makes you feel, I almost felt like I was fulfilling some calling. I mean, it was part of my being. I just couldn't really help it. I was being drawn towards this. And I didn't want to even consider getting out into the material world. I mean, obviously everybody's got to live in it. I'm not saying you should deny the material world and go and sit in some monastery. I don't mean that. You have to live in it. And you have to respect it. You have to respect its life forms. But I've just forgotten your last question.
How much of an overlap was there between Wiccan groups and spiritualist groups at the time?
Most groups kept to themselves, but they communicated with other groups that were serious. But then in the mid-60s, what happened was witchcraft slowly became fashionable, which is deadly. Because once something starts getting fashionable, it attracts people that want to sort of use it for personal gain or publicity purposes. Or hence we have in the mid-60s all the barrage of witchcraft magazines which started then, and all these stories in the Sunday papers. One I remember very well from 66, 67 was called Witchcraft, and that kept going for a good many years, and then finally turned into New Witchcraft, which I wrote some articles for. I don't have a copy of one of these magazines now to show you, but they were full of sort of people dressed up in robes or semi-naked witches, and they played a lot on the sex angle, this sort of thing, and of course it attracted people. But it wasn't really the serious side of it. Right. Or should I say that the people who were attracted to it because of these magazines, because of the Sunday papers, weren't really involved in the deep side of it.
So how did the more traditional groups react to the publicity?
They didn't like it. Right. They absolutely shunned it. Obviously it's very tempting. I mean, if you know something's in the Sunday paper, that's somebody putting curses on people and there's a half-naked witch, it's very tempting. I mean, even for me, you just got to pick it up, it's human nature, and read it. And I saw a lot of these articles at that time. But I used to look upon it as sort of superficial witchcraft. It was all based on something, but people didn't really know in reality what it was based on. There was a serious side to it, which a lot of these groups weren't.
As well as Helen's Wiccan coven, you set up your own group. What can you tell us about that?
I was using my flat in Highgate to conduct other rituals that dealt with people that really wanted to get involved in the side Helen didn't approve of. Let's put it like that. Initially, at one stage, we called it the Order of the Black Moon. Black not meaning black magic, black because the new moon, as you know, is black. Indeed, it was that group that got known quite well locally in Highgate.
Did you use a pre-existing system for your sex magic experiments, or did you create your own?
I created my own as a matter of of the knowledge I'd acquired to become involved in the Barnet Coven. As I said, it gives you a great deal of insight, makes you much more, what's the word, not psychic, but shall we say, or sensitive. And that, coupled with the fact that I had access to certain rituals, I just took them a little bit further. Those particular ceremonies, incidentally, I don't conduct them anymore. I'm going back in time, but they do invoke a great deal of energy. Invoke, or even maybe equally release energy which is already dormant in people. And the sex act is just used as an avenue where the energy is released. That's all. They weren't utilised for any perverse reasons, certainly not. I mean, I wouldn't have... If I wanted to do that, I wouldn't have needed an excuse. Especially in the 60s. You just don't need an excuse to do that.
How much of an influence was Dennis Wheatley?
I've never ever read one of Dennis Wheatley's books, and when I was later involved in a trial, which I mentioned briefly later, but skipping ahead, Dennis Wheatley actually was contacted by some newspaper, and he actually said that I was involved in black magic, which I never have been involved in black magic, and I actually named him on a writ, because I had a libel action against the Daily Express, and I was going to get him to court and make him explain in court exactly how he came to that conclusion. But as it happened, he actually died before that case came to court in the 1980s.
Tell us a little about the British Occult Society.
In 1967, I founded with other people the British Psychic and Occult Society, or British Occult Society as it was then, but we had to change the name later for other reasons. And the purpose of that society was it wasn't really anything to do with witchcraft, Wicca, but it was to look into cases of unexplained phenomena. All cases of unexplained phenomena. Not so much UFOs, but certainly haunted houses, haunted castles, apparitions, poltergeist activity, things people had experienced with so-called ghosts. And indeed, we used to investigate cases all over the country. Really, in those days, I was out there with other people on the field, and I experienced quite a few things. But then again, having said that, by the law of averages, I would have done, because the average person is sitting home watching television all night, then just going to bed. I mean, he's not in a position to experience these psychic things. It grew very, very quickly. It attracted musicians, doctors. One person that actually approached me in those days, who actually had a high interest in Highgate Cemetery itself, was Joe Meek, who, as you know, later shot his landlady, and he then he turned the gun on himself.
Why did he come to see you?
Well, he was very interested in Wicca and magic, but more magic. And he actually came to my flat, and it was adorned with sort of what people would consider, well, witchcraft symbols, if you like. We had an altar there, but it was only for the purposes of self-study. You know, candles on it. Not black candles, white candles, or red candles, or gold candles. Of course, when he actually visited me, he would have seen all this, which increased his interest.
And what did he seem like to you?
Well, I don't wish to speak ill of the dead, but he was a very nice person, but he did seem slightly neurotic. I had the feeling that his interest, had he got involved too seriously, it wouldn't have done him any good. He initially approached me. He'd actually approached some other groups he told me about, and he actually said that he wanted to become initiated into it. And what with one thing and another, it just didn't happen. He visited me, I think, twice, and it was the second time I was sort of told about him. I know he wanted to communicate with spirits, that's definite. I did know he'd been to Highgate Cemetery. Drawn there by the rumours of ghosts, it was quite close to where he lived. I understand he was living in Holloway Road at that time. And that's probably why he was drawn there, because the place had, in those days, it had a tremendous atmosphere. In fact, if you walked in there now, you just wouldn't. It wouldn't be like the same place, because it's been taken over by the Friends of Highgate Cemetery. I'm not condemning them. They've done a marvellous job, but it hasn't got the same atmosphere anymore. We're talking about the western half, not the eastern half where Karl Marx is buried. That's always been fairly respectable, fairly well kept. But the old side, the old part, if you like, I think it was opened in 1839. And in those days, the Victorians had a tendency, well, the poorer people were actually buried underground, but the richer people, and bear in mind Highgate was quite an aloof area even in Victorian times, tended to be buried in catacombs, vaults, and of course over the years these became sort of run down and vandalised, and hence you have all the bodies and the stories of skeletons and the stories of ghosts.
Graham Bond of the Graham Bond organisation, he came to see you as well, didn't he?
Yes, he actually came to see me. I'm jumping ahead now to 1973. He was with another man, a very sinister-looking man, actually. I never knew who he was. I don't remember his name. He was told me. I was introduced, only by his first name. He too came to visit me at my flat in Highgate. He actually committed suicide. I believe the verdict was suicide. Whatever event, he certainly fell under a tube train. When his body was discovered, they found he was wearing a protective white magic emblem around his neck. The reason he'd come to see me was because many years later, I was quite well known locally, and you know how rumours spread, God knows what I wasn't supposed to have done. At that time we were using Highgate Woods at night to conduct some rituals, mainly because it was secluded. In those days there was a pavilion there, but it was deserted at night, and the keepers in those days didn't used to actually live inside the wood at night. Second reason was that because in Wicca you're supposed to conduct these things at night. Not that there's anything sinister in that, but in Wicca we accept the existence of a feminine principle and a male principle. That's a male god and a female goddess. She is symbolised by the powers of nature, by the power of the moon, which obviously comes out at night. And that's the only reason. There's nothing sinister in it. It got around locally that we'd sacrificed a cat, which just wasn't true. Long John Baldry, who was the blues singer, who was at that time living in Muswell Hill, he'd heard the stories, and he automatically, because there'd been rumours and speculation in the local press, his cat, by coincidence, at that time had gone missing. I even remember its name, it was in the paper, Stoopsy. It had wandered off, and he approached the paper was the Haunted Journal, and he accused me of sacrificing his cat because it had disappeared. I was approached by the Journal, and I just brushed it off, but maybe not to the extent of denying it enough, because my attitude in those days was if people want to believe all this nonsense, it's not my problem, they've got their own problem. And they ran a story in the local paper quoting Baldry saying that I sacrificed Stoopsy at a magical witchcraft ritual. Well, about 2 weeks later, Stoopsy turned up, completely unharmed. It had wandered off. I don't know why cats do wander off like that, but I believe they do occasionally. But anyway, the whole point is that Long John Baldry didn't even contact the Haunted Journal to say, look, my cat's come back. Subsequently, I didn't even know about it. It was only 7 years after that when I had a libel action against the paper, the Daily Express, and they called Long John Baldry as a prosecution witness under cross-examination. Well, that was by myself, because I conducted the ritual myself. I learned all those years later that his cat had returned, and I actually said to him in court, I said, well, why didn't you inform the press? He said, well, I was so pleased to have the cat back that I didn't think it was important. So that's just one example of a story that got completely out of hand. Long John Baldry, somebody sent him 2 voodoo effigies. Now, I know who that somebody was, and it wasn't myself. Actually, as a result of receiving those effigies, Baldry was convinced he was under a curse. He said that the house had a really dark, heavy atmosphere. There was no light in it anymore, and it turned cold, and he was absolutely convinced he was the victim of a curse, so he called in Graham Bond. Graham Bond, that's the reason for Graham Bond's visit to me. Graham Bond came to see me, I don't know why, but, well, I do, he was warning me of the dangers of practising black magic, and I said to him, look, I do not practice black magic. And I said, there's proof of it there. I said, there's nothing black magic on that altar, for example. It was only shortly after that he committed suicide, and of course my name was then linked directly with his death, and I was not responsible for that at all.
And what about Alex Saunders, the so-called King of the Witches? Did you ever meet him?
No, I didn't personally, but I certainly got attacked by him. I remember they invited me on some radio programme. It could have been Radio 4. I think it was Brian Redhead, who was also dead. Everybody was dying. And they didn't tell me, but they had me there. And then Alex Saunders was on the phone, and he was condemning me on the programme, saying we weren't real witches and we couldn't raise enough power to boil an egg. He was the epitome of people that used to, what's the word, not so much commercialise witchcraft. I was approached by somebody called, whose name was Jeff. He'd actually been attending Alex Saunders' meetings at his flat and at a pub they used to meet in, which I believe was opposite his flat. And he actually told me that he was so disillusioned with not just Alex Saunders, but the whole way the thing had become commercialised, and he wanted to become initiated into my group. Right. And he eventually was.
So what kind of thing was going on in Highgate Cemetery at the time?
Well, I should tell you that there were a serious group of people who were actually using Highgate Cemetery in those days. This was in the late 60s. Indeed, not only Highgate Cemetery, I believe they were using the one at Kensal Green. And they were actually dedicated Satanists, because we used to find the aftermath of their rituals. And indeed, I and other people, we actually took photographs of them. And they were using Highgate Cemetery on a regular basis, possibly because it was undisturbed at night. I mean, because they used to go to very secluded parts of the cemetery. And yes, but that was going on. I didn't actually find out who they were, but they certainly made themselves known to me, because when the British Psychic and Occult Society started investigating their activities, quite a few of the members, including myself, got threatening letters, and at least or two of them were signed in blood. I didn't get it analysed. I don't know if it was animal's blood or human blood, but I think they were trying to give me some sort of message, which wasn't, because by that time, late 60s, my name had been associated with the cemetery as investigating reports of a ghost that had been seen there.
And how did people describe this ghost?
Tall, dark figure, was supposed to have red eyes. I actually witnessed quite a few people that had actually seen it. One was an old lady. She was walking her dog past the gates of the cemetery one night. She used to do every night. She used to live just some flats at the back. And the dog started to whine. It tried to drag her back down the road. And she actually told me she'd seen a tall, dark figure with hypnotic red eyes. And I actually interviewed another person who'd seen it in the cemetery. I called him Thornton. He was an accountant. He'd just gone into Highgate Cemetery to look around. They used to close the main gate when it got dark, at dusk. And he heard the bell going, and it was being rang to warn people to leave. But he was lost. He couldn't find his way out, so he thought he'd make his way towards the sound of the bell. And he told me he actually witnessed, he sensed something behind him, and he swung around, and he witnessed the same figure, a tall, dark figure. And in the end, I decided to visit Highgate Cemetery myself. It was late 69. I went there because I lived quite near the cemetery. The idea was to try and find a logical explanation. Before undertaking any psychic investigation, I always look for a logical explanation, and quite a few times you find one. In this case at the cemetery, I thought, well, I was actually considering the possibility it could have been a large animal like a fox, because they were actually breeding in Highgate Cemetery at that time. There were quite a few of them. or I thought it could have been a shadow, the moon casting a shadow through moving branches, and that had been distorted, and that was it. I didn't really know what I was looking for, but then I actually saw something myself as I passed the top gate. And I actually saw, and this is, I think it's, my whole career, it's about the only time I actually say I really came across something that you possibly term potent. Saw a tall figure there, and the point is that I actually thought it was real at first, meaning I thought it was human. I thought, because by this time the vampire, the ghost had been turned into a vampire, mainly because of the eyes, and it was circulating locally. It was in the local press. We picked up the stories from local pubs. I actually witnessed this figure, and I did notice there were two distinct points of light, and they were reddish, and I took it to be its eyes, and I felt I was being drained of energy, and the surrounding area had turned cold. And I soon realised that I'd seen the same thing as Thornton had seen, and I'd come under psychic attack. And just as in the case of Thornton, all of a sudden it wasn't there, and the temperature returns to normal. It's almost as if you're looking at a TV picture and you suddenly switch it off. And after that I reported back, and we launched an investigation into the history of Highgate Cemetery, and we actually learned that a tall dark figure had been seen back in Victorian era, seen disappearing mysteriously through the cemetery wall around the same point. Well, the outcome was that after we checked the cemetery's history, we decided to enter Highgate Cemetery one night and conduct a psychic seance using a psychic medium to try and make communication with whatever it was. There was myself, a lady who was a psychic medium, and other members of the BPOS, and we had psychic implements with us, obviously cameras to try and record it and things like that. And but that proposed ceremony got interrupted by the police.
And what were they doing there?
They were just keeping an eye on the cemetery. It wouldn't have been. I don't think it could have been tipped off, because no one knew it was going to take place. They were certainly tipped off at a later date about other ceremonies, but not this time.
So what happened? Were you charged?
I was told by the inspector in charge, if I pleaded guilty, the case would go to the magistrate's court the next morning, and I'd get a warning for trespass. So I gave a false name deliberately, because I was trying to protect myself, obviously, other members of the BPOS. And I took him at his word that if I pleaded guilty, it would just sort of go ahead unheard. You know, just a group of trespassing in the cemetery. And when I went to court, the actual magistrate's name was Christopher Lee. I can't resist saying that, but it's true. It really was true. It went to court 3 times. The first occasion it was Christopher Lee. The police attributed to me a statement I didn't make, to the effect of, my intention was to seek out the king vampire of the undead, which was also being called at this time, look through the coffins, opening them if necessary, and when I found it, I intended to stake my wooden stake through stake my wooden stake through its heart, and then run away. Well, because I pleaded guilty, that statement was read out in court. Bear in mind the court didn't know my real name, but then nevertheless it was read out in court. And because I pleaded guilty to that charge, it was automatically this statement was believed. And of course the implication was that I was in some way responsible for all the vandalism and opening coffins. So I immediately, police hadn't kept their side of the bargain, so I immediately changed my plea to not guilty. I gave the police my real name and said this was part of a serious psychic investigation. And it came back to court. Oh, can I add, when that statement was read out in court, it's what's known as absolute privilege, or qualified privilege, meaning that the press can report it without any fear of libel, because it's been stated in court. Of course, that statement, my so-called confession, made worldwide headlines, and that's how I became branded as a vampire hunter. Whereas I'm not, I'm a psychic investigator. And to cut a long story short, that when that case was eventually heard, I was acquitted, as I sort of proved in court. It was part of a serious psychic investigation.
So what would you have done if you hadn't been caught?
The idea was to make 2 circles on the ground, only symbolic, maybe with chalk or something. And the medium, as this entity was potentially dangerous or rather potent, and it was certainly earthbound, we thought, command it to appear in a small circle, which would have contained the element of fire. Not a fire, but I mean burning charcoal to represent fire. And she would have summoned it to the earthly plane. And we would, through her, the intention was to try and find out, well, first of all, was it in fact anything there at all? Was it just maybe a non-entity, if you like? And she intended to communicate with it. But as I said, it never got that far.
Having seen lots of photographs of you at this time, you were certainly very flamboyantly dressed for a psychic investigator. Were velvet jackets and frilly shirts practical to be tramping around in the cemetery at night?
I often used to get involved with giving talks and writing about it, and because of that I was often asked for photographs by magazines, by the press, and obviously if you're going to get a photograph taken of you, you don't want to just stand there in jeans and a t-shirt. Well, no offence intended to you, by the way. No, but for a photograph, I mean, it's only natural. So, yeah, that's how a lot of those photographs came into being.
Great pictures.
And a lot more of those photographs came into being because I was approached by TV and magazines, and they wanted pictures of witchcraft ceremonies, I mean, for publication, to accompany maybe an article I was writing. I didn't see any harm in doing that.
You and the Highgate Vampire both achieved a certain notoriety after this. What happened?
Well, everybody tried to cash in on that case. I think a lot of them did it to be honest with you, was for the purposes of publicity. There were 2 people actually arrested in Highgate Cemetery one night, and they'd heard about me in the paper, hunting a vampire, and they'd gone in there apparently following what they wrongly believed to be my example. So my appearance in court had influenced people, but they were just released because when they actually got caught, they said, it was only for a joke. They got cold feet. Anyway, yes, and there were other people who were involved too. Her death had a profound effect upon me. I was in my early teens. Her death had a profound effect upon me, and eventually I sought out, when I was a bit older, after I'd left school, I spent some time on the continent, just travelling around and working, doing odd things, picking grapes, picking pears, moving deck chairs on the beaches, that sort of thing. But when I came back to England, much to the disapproval of my father, I might hasten to add, I never needed money in those days, so that wasn't a problem. I saw, when I came...
David, how did you first get involved in witchcraft?
I was influenced by my mother. She wasn't a witch, but she was heavily involved in spiritualism. I think she used to attend a meeting in a church in Kentish Town, and also one up in Finchley at that time. I'm going back to the mid-50s, the late 50s, and I do remember that her involvement used to cause a lot of conflict between her and my father. They were always arguing about it, mainly because she'd go out and she'd come back very late at night. He was a very down-to-earth, materialistic man. He was a company director. She was the complete opposite, and she was often trying to guide me in those very early days about things more ethereal. We used to have discussions about God, nature, that sort of thing. She always used to tell me about healing. I remember once in those days, for example, if you happened to burn yourself, one of the common beliefs at that time was you used to have to put butter on it. And I did that once at school. I burned back England, I was 16, 17, I sought out friends of my mother's. One was a lady who actually, she is initiated, and she's quite well known in Ireland at this moment, and she's a white witch, and she actually writes books on witchcraft. I spent a lot of time studying under her and another lady, well, her name was Helen, and she was quite an elderly lady, and she taught me about a lot of things in white magic. I was actually initiated into it in 1964. I was initiated at my hand, and they made me soak it in butter, and it increased the pain of the burn. And when my mother saw it in the evening, she went mad. She washed it all off and soaked a bandage in cold water, and she said, keep that on it. And nowadays, all these years later, they've suddenly realised that the proper way to treat people with heavy burns is to submerge them in baths of cold water, because it speeds up the healing. Only a little thing, but I mean, she understood things like that, and she was trying to explain to me there were powers in nature. Unfortunately, my mother died in 1959, and